So it's great to be speaking to you at this Multiply 2020 conference. I've got a handful of things I want to share with you, which I hope will be useful, but if they're not, please don't worry. It'll all be over in about 10 minutes. So three things. First of all, in the Church of England, we have too many churches, and I think the answer is that we should have more. Secondly, every church was planted once. And thirdly, Europe was not evangelised by vicars. So, here we go. First thing, the Church of England has too many churches. And I think the answer is to have more. This seems to me to be a nice gospel paradox. What do I mean? Well, the Church of England has got too many churches which are kind of wedded to a model of church, which is church equals building, equals vicar, equals geographic area. And this way of being the church is certainly financially challenged at the moment, but also I think it's theologically and missiologically challenged. A church isn't a building. We're perhaps discovering that more and more at the moment as we can't access and use our buildings in the way that we've been used to. And the church certainly isn't just a vicar or just a geographic area. That's just one way of being the church. We'll come back to where it came from in a minute. No, the church is the people of God. The church is that bunch of men and women who have been so impacted by what God has done in Jesus Christ that they are following him, and it is him who is the centre of their life, and it is from him, his death and his resurrection, that they have a whole new world view. They want to live and share that with others. So a church is a worshipping and witnessing community. And I believe that God is leading us into a new way of being the church, in a new mixed ecology of church, where we're still going to have our vicars and our buildings and our geographic areas, but that will no longer be the gold standard of church. We will have a mixed ecology of church, where alongside those inherited patterns, we will see a whole new smorgasbord of ministries and churches emerging, which is, of course, what is happening around us at the moment. And I long to see that take its central place in the life of the church, and I hope, some of you may have heard, I've landed a Palace for Duty job in the north of England. I'm going to be the Archbishop of York in a few weeks' time. I hope that from that new position, and with the opportunities that I will have to try to shape the thinking of the Church of England, this mixed ecology way of being the church will be much more central to all our thinking. So we need to have a church which is both cherishing that which we've inherited and cherishing and encouraging that which is new. Secondly, every church was planted once at some point in history. And this is such an obvious thing to say, but so often the obvious is neglected. We need to remind ourselves of this, especially those who perhaps are anxious about the other things I've been saying about a mixed ecology church. So let me suggest you do this. Next time you go into your church building, when you're able to, find that board somewhere in the church which has the list of the vicars on it. And if you go to the top left-hand corner, you will see the name of the first vicar of that church and then all the others down through the centuries. It's actually a really moving thing to do, to see the continuity of ministry down the centuries, to thank God for those faithful people who led the church. But focus on the first person and the first date. I live in a little village at the moment in Essex called Margaretting. The church, I think, was built in the 12th century. So let's say, for instance, the church was built in 1157. That's when the first vicar started. The question I want us to ask ourselves is, so what happened in 1156? Well, this is the answer. It must be the answer. In 1156 or 1155 or whenever it was, there was a bunch of men and women who had been so impacted by the life, death and resurrection of Jesus that this was their new world view, that they believed and had the energy and the vision to say there must be a church in Margaretting. And because that was a much more settled community, that meant building a building which served that local neighbourhood community. That's how the church in this village started. And that, of course, is how every church started. Every church began once, and at its beginning was a vision by a small group of people who said, in order to communicate the goodness of God and the liberating good news of the gospel to these people in this community, we are going to have a new church. What we now need to be doing across the whole of our nation is to say, where are the networks as well as the neighbourhoods, the new housing communities and the new as yet unreached with the gospel groups of people amongst whom we need to plant some fresh expression of church. We need to develop some pioneer ministry so that the church may be present for them. And finally, this is my hobby horse. Let me ride it quickly round your room once, and then I promise I'll get off and shut up. Europe was not evangelised by vicars. Vicars, that way of being the church that we need to both cherish but move on beyond, with a mixed ecology of church, that way of being church was the consequence of the evangelisation of Europe, not the cause. Who did evangelise Europe? Well, this requires a much longer answer than the 10 minutes I've been given, but in a nutshell, Europe was evangelised by small monastic communities, groups of men and women so committed to following the life of Christ that they formed little missional communities which lived and shared the gospel in the neighbourhoods and networks of Europe. And then they were so successful at this that they developed a model of church which worked well for centuries in a much more settled, stable, Christendom kind of world, but doesn't serve us so well today. It's not, let me emphasise the point again, it's not that we want to dismantle this or get away from it, but we've simply got to stop putting all our eggs in the vicar basket. We've got to allow different ways of being church, where the church is worshipping, witnessing, pioneering community to flourish alongside it. And therefore, the way that we will, let's set the bar of our expectations high, the way we will evangelise Europe again, that is the task that God has set before us, is, I think, much more likely to be through a flourishing and rebirthing of small monastic type communities, fresh expressions of church, pioneer communities, missional communities, living alongside more settled models of church where bishops and archdeacons and clergy with oversight of different types of church will lead us to become once again salt, light, good news for the people of this nation, for all its neighbourhoods and networks and communities, and to participate with God in his great mission of love to the world. And very finally, I promise, this is what I perhaps should have said at the beginning. Of course, this is God's work. God is the missionary God who sends his Son, Jesus Christ, into the world, who works through men and women, forming communities of faith. And what we are called to do today is simply, joyfully, as effectively as we can, join in with God in this way of being known, which is through Jesus, is through those who follow him, and is through his one holy Catholic, and let us pray, with fresh zeal and purpose, apostolic church.